So the way narrative works, Dave, with the Israelis and Palestinians is that it's extremely powerful. It draws you in. It's extremely evocative, and you can't really fight it. If you spend a day with Israelis, you will hate Palestinians. You spend a day with Palestinians, you will join an anti-Israel protest. You've got the United Nations in Lebanon. You've got the United Nations in hovering over Israel and Palestine for all these years. They've done nothing. You've got the UN Secretary General now, who periodically puts out statements condemning this, condemning Rafah, condemning something else. The Palestinians think the United Nations is a bunch of losers who haven't been able to achieve what they were supposed to. The Israelis think UN are basically pro-Palestinian stooges sitting there and doing rudali for the Palestinians and nothing else. They don't care two hoots about the suffering of Israelis. As far as non-alignment is concerned, there's a bit of a paradox here. Now, India can aspire to be a big regional player, a big global player, but if it wants to do that, then it can't have a kind of this is all we are going to say or do as far as this situation is concerned.
Hello and welcome to the 23rd episode of In Our Defense. Shiv, I have a concern I want to raise with you. It's at a professional level. How is it possible that you, one of India's top defense journalists, one of the senior most people in our group over here, failed to alert us about this groundbreaking piece of breaking news that came, I think, yesterday or the day before, of the launch of India's first indigenous bomber UAV, made by this company called the Flying Wedge Defense and Aerospace Technologies, led by a person called Suhas Tejas Kanda.
Yeah.
A lovely looking piece of equipment, groundbreaking stuff. Zero flashes from you on this, man.
It's one of my biggest journalistic failures because I completely missed the story and everyone scooped it long before me, and I have a feeling that this is a blot on my career so far, but what can I say, Dev? Once in a while in everyone's career, something happens where you miss a really big story. But, this is something that I'm still wrapping my head around, because you've seen the pictures. You've seen how this has become this incredible, hilarious media sensation. And I think someone has missed the joke. Someone somewhere is sitting and laughing about this whole thing. And I can tell you that having missed the story, as you rightly pointed out, it's taken Indian industry, to a certain level of shock. They're wondering, what the hell is this? Who is this guy? What is this company? Where did this bomber UAV come from? Why is the media going crazy covering it in this manner? So I think a certain degree of introspection is going to be needed on this.
For our listeners who are not able to see us, and because visually for our viewers on YouTube, I think it's going to be pretty obvious that we were being highly sarcastic. But for listeners, I think it might be like, what are they talking about?
Best to clarify.
So best to clarify, yes, this is probably, I don't even know what this video was. I mean, it was probably done to get some attention on social media or something. But it's definitely a spoof. That UAV looks like a piece of cardboard, I think, I don't know, or maybe a sort of a balloon, and the guy also
but the thing is, it isn't a spoof. That's the point. The scary part about all this, Dev, is this I think the success of this public relations effort means that one of the top podcasts in the country is discussing it. So, but of course, we're not covering it the way the generic media has been covering it, as if it's some kind of big defense achievement. We, of course, are dissecting the ludicrousness of this whole story. Obviously, there has been a certain amount of generated public relations around this story. This couldn't have happened just as is, and I don't leave out any media. All media have been drawn to this story because it looks attractive. A bomber UAV, a guy standing in front of it, India's first, and things like that. We in media know about how people do PR for their products and stuff. And but this is actually pretty scary. Jokes apart and sarcasm apart, it's the effect this has had is actually to suggest that Indian industry is not serious. Now I actually did a bit of digging around on this. Now, no disrespect to any company or any individual. Everyone's doing their bit and trying to work hard. But the Flying Wedge, this company, the website suggests that it has a certain portfolio of drones that it operates or sells, and There are even some media articles about some government agreements and stuff. I don't know about supply, but they have agricultural drones, etc. But this particular media event where they had this so-called bomber drone is so far-fetched. It's so unserious in what it claims to be, that it has kind of negated the seriousness with which the Indian private sector defense industry wants to be taken. And let's remember, as a final point, that when it comes to drones, unlike many other pieces of equipment, India is actually doing
Yes.
very good work. We've got companies building excellent, competitively priced drones for the Indian and the international market that are in many ways far better, far superior than Chinese drones, which currently dominate the global market. And therefore, for something like this or someone like this, and there are videos of him in uniform, dressed like Kim Jong Un, and all kinds of weird, surreal stuff coming out. So one isn't able to get a fix over whether this is satire, whether this is a spoof. Is he being serious? Is this just a sense of style? I'm no one to judge, but let's be clear. Defense is a serious business. It has no place for doubt about intentions, seriousness, satire and things like that. Those things have their place elsewhere, but this is a person who's been covered in the mainstream media, for God's sake. So, and you're talking about bomber UAVs, which can't be operated by private persons. They have to be operated by the military for war-like purposes. And therefore, for there to be a sense of doubt and a sense of hilarity about that kind of thing, and this overwhelming media attention to it without basic questions about who this guy is, what is this company, what are these products that they appear to be unveiling in these large five-star hotel events, I think is a sad commentary on the media. I think it's we who need to look inwards about the attention we paid to this, rather than this guy who might well be just taking people for a ride.
Yeah, a good point there about how the private industry, when it comes to drones, has really excelled in India. And a good example of that, I think from last year, during the Republic Day celebrations, there was this demonstration of a swarm drone system that had a nice sort of a late evening, early night visuals, and it's a very good video. You can look it up online for our listeners and viewers, and you'll get my point. Right, let's move on to some more serious stuff on matters of defense. We'll talk about an actual raging conflict, because for a few episodes now, we've been talking about lots of theories and, stuff in like,
Lots of weapons.
lots of weapons and stuff in the domain of, what if this happened, what if that happened. Let's talk and focus a bit on an actual raging conflict that's been going on for the last seven, 8 months. That's the Israel-Hamas war.
Yeah.
A lot of attention of late on the war, primarily because of two reasons. One, of a new offensive that Israel has launched in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, which we'll come to in a short while, and the lot of protests that are happening in the US at campuses across the US. Don't want to get into the US politics at all right now, but we will definitely talk about US in the second half of this episode, because when I was kind of figuring out what we want to talk about, I think apart from just the war, we'll also focus a bit on how useless the world has been at stopping the humanitarian crisis or the war itself, and especially the UN. We'll come to that as well. First, let's talk about the current offensive. It's been 7 months now. You've been to Israel, I think in the initial few weeks when the conflicts began after the October 7th attack by the terrorist group of Hamas. We've spoke about it, I think, during our first episode when we launched season 2, and we spoke briefly about the Israel-Hamas war. So tell us about the Rafah offensive. When you look at the map of Gaza, what I understand, the overview I'm sort of getting is, for me at least, this seems to be the beginning of the end as far as Israel's ultimate goal of wiping Hamas out from the Gaza Strip is concerned. It might take a few more months. We're not sure. We don't know that. But I think that's basically sort of it, because Israel itself has said this is one of the last strongholds of Hamas in Gaza area. I'm sorry. So what's happening right now with this offensive? How do you see it? Do you also see it as the starting of the end? And crucially, what do you think? And this is gonna be pure speculation, because there's no really hard evidence on which to go by. But what do you think politically will happen in Gaza after Israel has quote unquote achieved its objective of wiping Hamas out? Do you see Israel taking complete control, or do you see Israel leaving Gazans to fend for themselves?
So, as the day that we're recording this podcast, Dave, is 214 days since the Hamas attack on October the 7th last year. 214 days makes it Israel's longest ever operation in Gaza. Previous operations, the 3 or 4 previous operations that have happened in Gaza have lasted, anywhere between 15 days and a couple of months. But here we're talking, like you said, 214 days. That's a long time. This has gone from being, a limited incursion, a limited ground and air operation against Gaza, which is what it looked like when I was there. I was there in October, November. That's what it looked like. But here we are now in May. The autumn went into winter, winter has come into summer, and the war isn't ending. But I think you're right when you say that by sheer measure of how much the Israeli military has managed to do in Gaza, and we'll come to the damage and death in a moment. There's literally nothing left to achieve, if you know what I mean. Two things to remember about what's happening right now, which is very important. Rafah is basically the border between Gaza and Egypt. The Gaza Strip shares a small strip of border with Egypt, which contains the famous Rafah crossing, from which almost all ground aid that's been entering Gaza since the beginning of this conflict has entered through the Rafah crossing. So any aid that needs to go into Gaza from the ground, which is where all aid comes from, needs to land in Egypt, go to Rafah, the Rafah crossing on the Egypt side, and from there that aid moves into Gaza. As of now, with the bombing of Rafah, with all its attendant casualties, and Rafah is like the border Palestinian town in Gaza, and then there's a border fence and a entry point, and the other side is Egypt, basically. With this, Israel basically, in effect, has either bombed or attacked or controls from the ground all of Gaza. Now, we're sitting in a situation where it's taken 214 days. The ground offensive and the air operations have continued non-stop. Initially when I was there, it looked like there may be a lightning fast operation to go in, demonstrate to the Hamas that Israel means business, and then come out in order to ensure that the hostages are returned. The big question mark at this point of time, and the point that Israel makes to justify everything it is currently doing, remains the fact that I think one estimate says 136 hostages are still theoretically in Hamas captivity. Now there is no real way to tell whether all of those hostages are still alive. It seems unlikely that all of them are alive, or if even some of them are alive, because the bombing has been extensive in different parts of Gaza, and Gaza is not very big. There is reason to suggest that the tunnel network that the Hamas has in Gaza is where many of these hostages would be. But like I keep saying, war is something that makes things more difficult for the people affected by it the longer they are in it, which means that Hamas, which had an offensive capability, including rockets and missiles and things like that in the initial days of the war, are completely disarmed right now. They have no weapon systems. And it seems unlikely to most observers, including me, that hostages would be something of a big priority for them. It is, of course, their leverage and their card to use against Israel. But at this point of time, the scale of destruction, the scale of death on the Palestinian side, you referred to the kind of international community tremors that have been taking place in different parts of the world, and I'm not surprised. Those have always been very, very strong, parts of the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's only that now, in this age of the internet and social media, the kind of mobilization we're seeing on US campuses and elsewhere is much, much more prevalent. But that's a measure of awareness and willingness to actually come out and mobilize more than anything else. But I remember that during the post years after the second Intifada, when I was in university in England, at that time there were mobilizations as well. But that apart, on the ground, I think, to answer your initial question, this is the end. The end appears to be in sight in terms of the kinetic war, in terms of the actual fighting, because there's nothing left to fight. You've reached Rafah. Rafah is the limit. Beyond that is Egypt. You can't fight Egypt. That's this border is where if Palestinians want to flee across the border into Egypt, that is now completely controlled by Israel. So in many ways, it's an end game. Rafah represents a kind of end game in terms of what more can the Israel military actually do at this point of time. They've bombed every part of Gaza. According to accepted estimates, about 34,000 Palestinians inside Gaza, including Hamas fighters, have been killed. The Hamas leadership continues to be on the outside. There is talk of an Egypt and Qatar negotiated truce agreement that would give the Gaza Strip some kind of a breather. But beyond that, there is no clarity on where this is going. But this seems to be imposing some kind of a limit in terms of how much more fighting can actually happen.
Right. Which begs the question. Israel, to me, has been coming across as very headstrong and very obstinate when it comes to just not giving a damn about any international voices. Whether it's whether it's the West, which has backed Israel, but at the same time has really called for restraint and has called for a way to ensure at least some sort of aid is given and is ensured in the Gaza Strip, etc. Why is that so? Is it the politics of Netanyahu? Is it the fact that which is what we discussed during the first episode of this season, that the Israel leadership has come across looking really, really bad after the October 7th attack? In fact, one of the top leaders of the Israeli military arms, I think the intelligence chief, he resigned a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, taking responsibility for the intel failures that led to the October 7th Hamas attack. And in that first episode, you've described in detail of how that attack really was a huge embarrassment for Israel and its defense forces and its very renowned defense forces. So we'll have a link to that episode in the show notes so people can quickly refer to it if you want to, if they're interested in that. But why this sort of headstrong behavior by Israel? Like I said, is it the politics to kind of cover up the mess of October 7, or do you actually see a strategy that you think will end up working and actually serving the supposed goals of Israel?
For the first time in this entire cycle of violence between Israel and Palestine, there appear to be no defined and manageable objectives. Now, this is a bit of a controversial thing to say because Israel will jump down my throat if they hear this, and they will hear this, believe me, to say, what do you mean by no defined endgame objectives? The endgame is to completely obliterate Hamas. The follow-up question to that in that case is, so who governs Gaza in that case? Is Israel going to take over that territory and govern Gaza itself? Are you going to install another government? It's completely bombed. There are 34,000 people who are, dead in the Gaza Strip. There are, I think at last estimate, almost 2 million displaced, practically refugee Palestinians whose houses have either been destroyed or they are no longer in their cities or towns in the Gaza Strip, who are out there. How are you going to, give this bombed place structure to revive, rebuild, and create government? Right now, it's just one big war zone. So what possible endgame does Israel actually see? But to fully understand and appreciate, what you call headstrong in Israeli politics is that Israel. The one thing I sense about Israel this time, and this was my first visit to Israel was this time, even though I've been watching the country for years, is that there appears to be a political unanimity and a kind of general sort of public political agreement that whatever happens now, it needs to be a finished business. Whether this is about destroying Hamas, whether this is about a solution, whether this is about creating structures such that Israel doesn't need to look over its shoulder ever again, whether this means negotiating some kind of. I'm just taking options out of the top of my head. This is not what Israel wants. Remember that. Creating a kind of system where politically, geographically, or otherwise, Israel. This does not have the possibility of becoming a flare-up situation ever again. Is the common consensus? The question is, how do you do that? You can't kill every Palestinian. You can't. You're not going to invade that territory and take it over and absorb it into Israel. The West Bank is a vast swath of territory, of the Palestinians. So what is the end game? You've got the Qatari leadership that protects the Hamas leadership in Qatar and Iran, etc. You've got the whole Iran factor, which we'll get to as well. So which is why I say that the end game objective still seems amorphous and ambiguous to me. And I think that is, ironically, the paradox here is that is what has fueled the longevity of this war. The fact that there is no defined, in military terms, having a well-defined military objective is an imperative. You have to know what you're trying to achieve so that military operation can be limited. If you don't know yourself what that final objective is, and even if something like obliterating Hamas might sound like a military objective, but it's colossally difficult to do. How do you know the Hamas has been obliterated? How do you know that there aren't still Hamas people among these displaced? How do you know that now that you've killed 34,000 people, according to one estimate, you haven't, like so many times in the past, simply sowed the seeds for the next generation of Hamas? These are not emotional arguments. This is exactly what has happened on Palestinian territory over and over and over again. I have close, good friends in Israel. I have close, good friends in Palestine. And I spent time with both sides this time. I think I was the only journalist, or the first journalist over there, who decided to go and spend a few days in the West Bank because I couldn't get into Gaza. I tried, I couldn't. So I went and spent time with Palestinian friends in Ramallah and other places. And the difficulty of covering this story from there is, from Israel or from Palestine, is that people with skin in the game can't not have an emotional argument about this. You've lost people in this. You know people who've lost people in this. Your livelihood, your security, the security of your family depends on what's going to happen. You've got very difficult dynamics in the world right now that impinge on how long this war is going to last. You've got Biden giving Israel everything it possibly needs for this offensive operation in Gaza, and at the same time saying, "Hey, take it easy and don't stop aid," and things like that. So there's this spectacular and very typical doublespeak coming in from the United States. You've got the United States looking like Venezuela right now, cracking down on students, for God's sake, on their university campuses. You may disagree with the students. You can dismiss the students as woke and all that and the other, but they're students. And you're cracking down on them, and you're arresting them, and you're handcuffing them, and you're throwing them up against walls and hitting professors and stuff. It's not making you look very good, and you've got an election to fight this year. Trump, notwithstanding Stormy Daniels, seems to be on an upswing as far as the United States is concerned. That's another horror story as far as Palestine and Israel is concerned. If Trump comes back as president, what happens to the whole Israel war dynamic? So all of these things are there. Netanyahu has managed to successfully weather and navigate and surf over the initial public derision for him. When I was in Israel, the public was really, really pissed off with Netanyahu. They were like, this man has slept at the wheel. He's allowed this to happen to our country. It's because of his complacence that we are in this situation where 150 of our people are now hostages. So the Israeli public was clear. They blamed Netanyahu for it. But as I said in the beginning, the longer war continues, the more ambiguous everything becomes. Now that anger is restricted to the political space, not so much the public. Now the public is more about, we need to get this done now. Now the public voices in Israel are much more about, we need to finish this work. We've put too much into it. We still don't have our hostages back, 136 apparently. We don't even know if all of them are alive right now. We don't even know if Hamas has the capacity to prove that any of them are alive or how many of them are actually alive right now. Rafah is gone. So you've got all these sort of flashing ambiguities right in front of Israel with no defined objective. There's no end in sight. Okay, if you're a soldier and you're told you've got to go and take over that small piece of land, and once you've taken it over and planted your flag on four corners, objective is done. You don't have that here. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but I'm saying Israel doesn't have an acceptable, actionable sort of to-do list that it can put down on paper and say, once these are done, then it's done. It's an open-ended war, and I think that's the most terrifying part.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very interesting point you made, actually, because I think, and that's the reason I think almost any analyst, defense or strategic in the world right now is unable to answer the basic question of what next, because no one bloody knows what next,
Yeah.
because this already is a very complicated issue, and then you have what you've described very perfectly, a very complicated war going on where even perhaps Israel does not know what next. I think once they are done with the Rafah offensive, it'll be like, okay, now we are everywhere in Gaza, now what? So a slight tangent, something on that point, a sort of a philosophical question, if you may, a sort of a very academic question, if you may, but I still think it's an important one. Do you think several people, including Israel, including people who are supporting the Palestinian cause or people who are supporting Israel, etc., have made a very, very terrible mistake of equating Gaza with Hamas completely and entirely? Like, Hamas is Gaza and Gaza is Hamas. Even though Hamas rules Gaza, we know that, ruled Gaza. But, do you think a mistake was made just equating it? Because when you say Gaza, it's just like you're talking about Hamas right now. You're forgetting that among those 34,000 estimated people who've been killed, the estimate, by the way, comes from the Gazan Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas. But yeah, among those people killed, several thousands will be innocents, will be civilians, and many of them are children. That's a fact. You cannot ignore that. So do you think that mistake has been made, and that's very worrying?
Look, whether you call it a mistake or not, the dynamic of Israel and Palestine will always be Israel looking at everyone in Gaza as Hamas. That is the brutal aspect of war. When you're in a war, everyone on that side is basically the enemy, because for a moment, let's remind ourselves that Hamas, now, not just post October 7th, 2023, but even before that, was perceived as a terrorist organization, a proscribed terrorist organization, not just by Israel, but several other countries, as a terrorist organization. To the Palestinians, Hamas is a political party, a political movement. I dislike words like movement and things like that. For all practical purposes, Hamas was a political party. A political party, like any political outfit, it's a political party that strives for power. We can argue about its means later, but it's basically a political party. It had a leader, it controls the health ministry, like you said. So Hamas was the political party that controlled Gaza. And the Arafat's Fatah organization, which is the other political party, is the controls the government in the West Bank. And these are competing political parties that don't often agree with each other, and they are at each other's throats quite often. But that was basically the kind of equilibrium that had been achieved after the last cycle of violence between the two sides. Now, the mistake that you talk about of painting all Palestinians as Hamas, all people who live in Gaza as Hamas, is I don't think it really affects how the world looks at things, because Israel on its side has persistently said that we don't look at all Gazans as Hamas. We don't paint them as that, and that's the reason why this war has taken 214 days. If we thought that Gaza was only Hamas, we would have just bombed the crap out of it in maybe 5 or 6 days. We could have flattened all of Gaza. The reason it's taken 214 days is because we're being careful, because we're using precision guided missiles. And even with all that, you've got colossal and terrible amounts of collateral damage and civilian life lost. But if you look at it in terms of the the narrative that is sometimes necessary to sell a war is it becomes a more palatable. All this destruction, all this violence, all this terrible loss of life, including of children and infants, becomes more palatable if you're able to project or paint the enemy as in a common kind of color. Now, listen, most people, the incredible war of narratives between Israel and Palestine, as I've always said, has been one of the most effective. It was the subject of my dissertation in my MA as well, is that it is very evocative. If you spend a day with Palestinians, you will become pro-Palestinian. You spend a day with Israelis, you will become anti-Israeli, and a part of you will hate Palestinians. You spend a day with Palestinians, by the end of that, you will be joining anti-Israel protests. Believe me, it's that evocative, it's that powerful, it's that emotional, it's that sentimental. But Israel and Palestine are not equals. So the way narrative works, Dave, with the Israelis and Palestinians is that it's extremely powerful. It draws you in. It's extremely evocative, and you can't really fight it. If you spend a day with Israelis, you will hate Palestinians. You spend a day with Palestinians, you will join an anti-Israel protest. That's the way it works, because these are narratives and truths. Many of these, I'm not saying it's only propaganda or narrative, but there are truths as well, which is that they're very emotional, they're full of suffering, they're full of personal stories. It's about the survival of a people on both sides, the way it's projected by each side. The underlying truth, of course, of all of this is that Israel and Palestine are not equal. They are not equal by any measure. They are not equal geographically, in terms of economically, in terms of weapons, in terms of anything. They're not equal. And that explains, of course, the imbalance that is perceived from the outside, triggering all these protests everywhere. It's the aggressor versus the underdog, the rebels versus the Goliath, etc. All those things will always be there. But let's make no mistake about how this cycle of violence has meant untold suffering, for the Palestinians, and death and destruction on the Israeli side as well, as we saw on October the 7th. The only point that I'd like to make about this idea of everyone in Gaza being seen as part of Hamas is, many a time, and this is something. This is a part of propaganda and narrative control on both sides, which is that one side is just the kind of helpless sufferers. Now, you have to understand that the Gaza Strip, before all this violence, was there will be one piece of propaganda that says it's basically an open-air prison. It's basically a sewer. It's enclosed on all sides and there's nothing happening there. It was a fully functioning mini nation. Fully functional. Villas, sports clubs, universities, swimming pools. I'm not saying it's anything comparable to Israel, but I'm just saying it was not an open-air prison.
Good beaches as well.
Beaches. Obviously, the Hamas leaders had the best villas and the beachside villas, etc. That's the caste system and the class system is everywhere in the world. Let's not argue about that. But all I'm saying is that it's not like it was a hellhole before all this happened. It was a fully functioning place. With whether the Hamas was ruling with an iron fist or not is a separate issue. But I'm saying that this was an accepted structure within Palestine. Now, not for a moment am I saying, well, if that's the case, if you voted for Hamas or you support the Hamas government, that makes you Hamas. Not at all. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that suits the war narrative. That suits the war narrative in Israel. That how do you differentiate between who is who? All these people functioned and lived and operated under a Hamas dispensation, and therefore they're okay with what has happened. But please remember, this is not, and that's the terrible kind of black hole sensation when it comes to Israel and Palestine, is it all stems from a kind of survival instinct. It's about, you are aggressors of my people. You are trying to erase my people. This is ethnic cleansing. This is genocide. You want to erase Palestinians from this land. So that's where that thinking comes from. Yeah. So as you can see, everything is really open-ended.
Yeah.
The question now that people need to ask is, when does this cycle end? Okay, the first Intifada, I think it went on for about a year and a half, and then there were usually these cycles of violence. They end with a kind of externally negotiated truce. There's some kind of externally negotiated truce. There is a uncomfortably decided, mutually decided dispensation that will take control of the revival aspect of Gaza and then become a kind of quasi-government in, post-conflict quasi-government in that area, acknowledged by Israel. How is that going to happen after all this is the question.
Yeah, good point there about how this issue is also very evocative. And I think the start of the beginning of this conflict and the current conflict as well, that is a very good example of that. So if you remember the images that came out of after October 7th attack, you could not help but feel strongly for Israel and be okay, yeah, there will be very justified to sort of launch a retaliation. And then you have the sort of images coming now from Gaza, of the destruction, of the death, and you can't help but feel sympathy for Palestinians and be like, what the hell is going on over here? Again, extremely complicated topic, extremely complicated war. So I think on the topic of the war itself, we'll kind of take a pause there. We'll now go to the whole aspect of how the other countries have kind of behaved around this current war and around the Israel-Palestine conflict in general, and also where India stands on that, but we'll do that for a quick break.
There was a frontline reporter who wrote about a family, about a father actually, who said that in front of his eyes, he saw his wife and children digging holes in the ground and looking for soil and rolling them and putting it in their mouths and swallowing them with water. So that's the situation because, starvation has hit the country.
Sudan right now is on the brink of famine.
Yeah.
Starvation. One of the UN agencies, UNHCR, actually said that they're living on leaves.
Oh my God.
So
they're eating grass.
They're eating grass and leaves because there's nothing to eat. And we have 4.5 million people displaced. 1 million outside of Sudan who left the country, have moved to Chad, Egypt, and the other neighboring countries, and the rest of them displaced within.
Welcome back. Shiv and I are talking about the Israel-Hamas war that has been going on for the last 7 months now. I want to now focus a bit on the other countries that are kind of involved some way or the other. And I also want to focus specifically on the United Nations, a topic that I think you've been itching to get to. And you mentioned this, I think, a couple of times on this podcast, that that's something that we should really talk about. So we'll do that also in the second half of this episode. But first, the US. I have lost count of the number of reports coming in the US media, all citing anonymous sources saying how pissed Joe Biden is with Israel, or BB as they like to call him in these reports, that he's very angry with him. He's going to give him a call and he's going to give him a piece of his mind about how he should be stopping all of this. Yet you have the US giving arms, ammunition, whatever Israel wants. I think the Biden administration sometime this week is supposed to not testify per se, but tell US Congress whether it thinks that American munitions have been used by Israel to commit war crimes. That's a separate matter altogether, though. But anyway, you're getting my point.
Yeah.
Do you think the US really cares? Because I just don't get this. Like you said, you kind of referred to it in the first half of this episode, that there is this just hypocritical double standards by US. On the one hand, you have these media reports where you keep saying, we are very angry with them. And you also have statements, by the way, we calling for restraint, this should not be happening. Yet you are there solidly with Israel, no matter what.
The United States has reached, in terms of global perceptions of the US, there's a new low. The 2023-24 has affected a new low for the United States. It is seen as a country that is hollow in its directives, hollow in its intent. Biden's dispensation especially is seen as almost a bit of a joke. It was seen as a joke when it came to Ukraine, which could be understood if not forgiven, because that was that's Russia, that's a different kettle of fish you're talking about. Here it's Israel. And Israel, for all practical purposes, again, I'm not saying this in a rude way, but I'm just saying geopolitically, is seen as a kind of satellite state of the United States. A satellite nation. It draws its military strength, it draws all its aid. The United States gives more aid to Israel than to all other countries combined, which is a stunning statistic, which is true even today. It's a country that draws all of its economic might and lifeblood from American largesse and generosity. And this is because of the Jewish population, and this is how it has always been. And this was a post-war setup that made this possible. And many of the things happened for good reasons post-war. This is not to suggest that Israel hasn't strengthened itself on its own abilities and talent and things like that. It most certainly has. Israelis are some of the most intelligent, industrious, committed people on earth. But the situation that Joe Biden finds himself in now is a situation where the military-industrial complex in the United States has a life of its own. Okay? War is America's biggest business. Let nobody have any illusions about that. Okay? There is no Biden, there is no Trump, there is no John Kennedy, there is nobody that can stop the wheels of the American military-industrial complex from turning. If there is even the slightest whiff of conflict somewhere, people are clinking glasses in boardrooms across the United States. Okay, it's the world's largest producer of weapons. This whole idea of whether American weapons have been used in war crimes, let me go a step and say they most definitely have. Okay, they most definitely have. Not just in Gaza and elsewhere, but in all theaters of the world, American weapons have been used in war crimes. There's no two ways about it because they're the world's largest producer of weapons. Now, the hypocrisy of Joe Biden in all of this, Dev, is that here's a man who's doesn't have the power to stop aid being given to Israel at a time when this is happening. B, tries to dramatize opposition to all this aggression by saying, I'm going to call Netanyahu and tell him to stop all this. So B, you've demonstrated that you have no power to make him stop. The whole world can see that you're doing this natak of imposing your strength on Netanyahu to get him to back off or ease up or allow aid, etc. You haven't been able to do that even once. One would have understood if Biden was able to roko the war briefly for something. He hasn't done it once in 214 days. So what leverage does the Biden, and note that I'm not saying American leverage, I'm saying Biden's leverage with Israel. That's not happened. He's got an election he faces later this year, which means that not only does he have to face Congress, but facing Congress, I think, are minor irritants. The larger aspect of all of this is how he has managed to do uncomfortable things and not reap the benefits of them. You're giving weapons to Israel. You're opposing the aggression. You're looking like an aggressor. You're being completely, you're being completely bamboozled by students across campuses like Harvard and Cornell and Columbia and Emory and things like that. And these are not invisible people. These are images that are being beamed all across the world. You control digital, Dev, so you know that these are some of the most viewed images of our time. Right? So how does that make Joe Biden look? It makes him look make him look silly, stupid. All those are passé things. It makes him look something that is the nightmare of all American presidents, and that is ineffective.
Yes.
It makes him look useless. It makes him look impotent, geopolitically speaking. And I think that is going to have a bearing on the Democratic Party, on the elections. But that's not our immediate concern. The immediate concern is you have a situation where Israel and Netanyahu do not respect what Biden's writ is. His writ doesn't work. America ka chalta nahi hai. That's, to put it very simply, it's almost like America ka chalta nahi hai ab Israel mein. And that was unthinkable at one point of time. the amount that America had pumped into Israel, the amount of American expat Jewish population that lived in the US and Israel, the commonly held perception that, the Jewish community controls all the strings of American power, is unable to, have his way even demonstrably, even in small things, he's not able to do it. So what does that tell you? So you've got a situation where the American public will be saying, hey, okay, you wanted to support Israel, but it's been 214 days. Where is this going? Are you going to continue, subsidizing this war, supplying Israel with weapons? What about all these people who think we're doing the wrong thing? So this has reached a point of no return in many ways, in my view, as far as Biden is concerned.
Yeah. Talking about jinka chalta nahi hai, the United Nations. In school we were taught that before the UN you had the League of Nations. The League of Nations was formed after the First World War, but because the League of Nations was unable completely entirely to be to stop the Second World War, it was disbanded, and then UN was formed. Very controversially I'm putting it, but it needs to be put. Do you think this is sort of a League of the Nations moment for the UN? First, you had the pandemic a couple of years ago, unable to do much apart from just, giving out statements, etc. You just literally had countries fighting for themselves, and, that was what it was. To cut, again, simplifying it, but that's mostly what happened. And then you have situations like the Russia-Ukraine war, you have the Israel-Hamas war, where you're not able to ensure humanitarian aid, you're not able to get the parties to back off, you're not able to do anything, basically. So why do you exist? Is what at times I start
Dave, I would forgive the United Nations for what they failed to do during the pandemic. I will, let's say that this was a unknown enemy, a brand new enemy. Everyone was feeling around in the dark, so the UN didn't really know how effectively to handle it. So let's forgive the United Nations for the pandemic. Let us even forgive the United Nations for Ukraine and Russia, because this was something that kind of came out of the blue. The intense and very small margins for error in terms of a larger escalation meant that large-scale United Nations movement was not possible, apart from the usual routine boilerplate nonsense that they usually spew. But Israel-Palestine is a conflict, geopolitical situation where the United Nations has been plugged in as an observer, solution provider, peacekeeper, interlocutor, negotiator, solution suggester for over half a century. They have a separate United Nations division for the Israel-Palestine situation. And, let's discount all the other things. Yes, it's geopolitically difficult because there's US and Iran and all these countries, Saudi Arabia, Arab world. Let's just cut away all the fat for a moment. You're the United Nations. Ultimately, the whole point of the United Nations is to have been able to find leverage and effectiveness to force resolutions and solutions, because you've got warring nations. If all countries agreed with each other and said, "Ha, yaar, ye bahut ho gaya, let's stop this war now," then what the hell do you need the United Nations for? The whole point of the UN is that you use your ability as an objective, neutral, multinational body to find strands of leverage and bring them together in such a way that each country feels invested in a ceasefire, in peace, in talks, in negotiations, and things like that. And therefore, and with that, the conflict ends. And then uske baad dekha jayega ki settlement, ye, wo, and all these. They haven't done that even once since the beginning of this conflict. You've got the United Nations in Lebanon. You've got the United Nations in, hovering over Israel and Palestine for all these years. They've done nothing. You've got the UN Secretary General now, who periodically puts out statements condemning this, condemning Rafah, condemning something else. The Palestinians think the United Nations is a bunch of losers who haven't been able to achieve what they were supposed to. the Israelis think UN are basically pro-Palestinian stooges sitting there and doing rudali for the Palestinians and nothing else. They don't care two hoots about the suffering of Israelis. The United Nations say, how can Israel compare itself to Palestine? The suffering has been much more over there, which is actually true. But the point is, the United Nations, whose strength was supposed to be that it had these ins with all these countries, had membership from all these countries, has basically just become a platform for the usual narrative.
Yes.
It's not an enforcer, it's not an imposer, it's a platform. And the United Nations is not a platform. It's not supposed to be a platform. The League of Nations was a committee of countries that came together with the onerous task of ensuring that another world war does not happen, which it beautifully failed at. But the United Nations had terms of reference, had powers, had resources, had access, had waivers, exponentially more than the League of Nations. The League of Nations was nothing compared to what the United Nations has been given, which is why you see the United Nations no matter where you go. Now, the United Nations will turn around and say, look, the work we do, it's behind the scenes. You don't see it. You don't, you have no idea how many things don't happen. And that's only thanks to us not, us being there and making sure these things happen. Sure, I'm sure that kind of happens in large organizations. But the simple truth before everyone is that Hamas attacked Israel. Israel has bombed the living daylights out of Gaza. Nearly 40,000 Gazans, including Hamas, are dead. Nearly 2 million people are displaced. And this hasn't happened for the first time. This is happening over, which is why I say it's a cycle of violence. This is not a war. This is the latest chapter in an unending spiral cycle of violence. Which comes back to the answer to your first question, which is there an endgame now? The United Nations has no idea.
Yep.
Because they've just become a kind of stage on which charges are traded now between the others. And very occasionally, Antonio Guterres or whoever that guy is, the UN Secretary General, will have a few things to say about both sides. So the United Nations is, in my view, an organization that is way too large for the piddly work that it does. And I'm not being unkind, because it really is a bloated organization. It's an enormous organization. Sure, it does some good work, especially in the field of health and children and education and things like that in extremely poor countries. But beyond that, the United Nations has not effectively imposed peace in any conflict part of the world, in my view.
Yeah. I don't think any person who has a good enough understanding of, international affairs would disagree with that assessment. Final thought, moving on to India and India's stand on such issues. Historically, India has been what was, again, taught in school books as non-aligned.
Yeah.
That sort of stance has more or less continued over various governments, whether it's, from either the Congress or the BJP or the other parties. And I think that's been more or less a very good strategic, sort of a sound diplomatic strategy to have for India. Even in the current Israel-Hamas conflict, India has been very clear that we don't. Obviously, it was a terrorist attack, so Israel has all the right to strike back. But obviously, we, not want a humanitarian crisis, and we've been sending aid to Palestine as well. And we have always supported the two-state solution. But and this is what I want to discuss with you. Until the 1901, before the liberalization, we were not as aspirational as we have become since then, right? Like for the entirety of my being on this earth, I've seen India aspire to be more and more. Now we've come to a stage where we aspire to be one of the bigger leaders in the world. We have big aspirations. We recently held the G20 summit where we achieved the difficult task of having a joint consensus statement, which included the topic of Russia-Ukraine war. And we've discussed on a previous episode how that was a solid boost for India's diplomatic community. So yeah, we aspire to be a big player in global affairs. So do you think India will now at some point have to start putting in skin in the game, and it cannot just like stay back and be like हाँ वो आप लोग का मामला है, हम बहुत उसमें घुसेंगे नहीं, because we don't really frankly have nothing much to do over there. And second, so that this does not become completely Anna's territory, who does a strategic episode podcast called Gita's World. Second, do you in your knowledge, does India also aspire to be a military power, or are we just okay with having a strong enough military that can, defend against Pakistan, China, any other threats that we have to, and that's it?
Okay, first let's list what skin India has in this game. Apart from the geopolitical aspirations, which India doesn't want to just be a regional power, we want to be a global power, and in many ways we are already that, especially post Ukraine, post pandemic. Now let's list what skin India has in the Israel-Palestine game. India has one of the few countries that has healthy diplomatic relations with both Israel as well as the Palestinian Authority. Not many countries that have that. B, India is a country that has unwaveringly advocated a two-state, peaceful, sustainable two-state solution. C, there is a sizable Indian expat population that lives in Israel. Even now, we've seen workers go there, to do many of the tasks as a result of the complete blockade of Palestinian workers following the attack on October the 7th. And there are many such economic linkages between the two countries. India is a large customer of Israeli weapons as well. So there's the military economic trade, and there are all these things. India has been a country that has built a lot of infrastructure for the Palestinians in the West Bank. I saw it myself, from water services to road infrastructure, flyovers, bridges, schools, warehouses. Many things are built there by the Indian government as a diplomatic gesture for the Palestinians. So there is, it's nowhere close to the kind of skin that the Americans have, obviously. No, not even comparable, but India has skin in the game in that sense, which is that we've invested in our friendships on both these sides. Now, one would argue that India's relationship with Israel has obviously taken a much faster track, and that's not difficult to understand or, figure out, because, unlike Palestine, Israel has the things that an aspiring and a dynamic and a liberalized, and an India in a hurry needs weapons. It needs, public partnerships. It needs, agricultural technology, which Israel has a large, bank of, and things like that. So the fact that the linkages between India and Israel, economically speaking, are more substantial are not difficult to, appreciate, because Israel and Palestine are also not comparable. But the linkages that India has with Palestine are historic, and India has never let Palestine down in that sense. However, as far as non-alignment is concerned, there's a bit of a paradox here. Now, India can aspire to be a big regional player, a big global player, but if it wants to do that, then it can't have a kind of this is all we are going to say or do as far as this situation is concerned. But that leads to the question as to what more can India do in this situation? What more can India do? There will be some in this high heat political atmosphere which will say, "Arey, Prime Minister to knows Bibi very well. He should use his influence." Or somebody else will say that, "Arey, we are sending all our workers there to do the dirty work that the Palestinians need to do. Why are we doing this? Isn't this a signal that we are more pro-Israel and against Palestine?" What I'm trying to say is that India is in a situation where there's not much it can actually do beyond the useless United Nations resolutions which don't lead to anything as such, which India has demonstrated. It votes quite dynamically in. It has voted against Israel. It has voted for Palestine. It has voted against Palestine on certain issues. There are case-to-case issues with which the Indian Foreign Office takes a decision on. But beyond that, at this point of time, there's nothing material that India can actually do to affect things. The reason for that also is that India, I believe, would most certainly do something if it saw that there was a possibility of it having a visible and far-reaching effect on the conflict on the ground. Now, nobody expects that India has that kind of capacity right now. Does it have the power to do something? It most certainly does. But does it make sense if it's not going to end the war, if it's not going to bring people to a negotiating table? India is not plugged into that Arab world situation where, countries like Qatar and Egypt are now, you're talking about some kind of a truce agreement, which will give Gaza a bit of a breather. India is not in that circuit right now. And it can't be. It can't be because that's a separate part of the world. Where India can get into things is in terms of leverage with Israel, in terms of aid for Palestinians, in terms of generating a greater deal of pressure on the international community to do something about Israel and Palestine. But beyond that, we have to remember that India also has its foreign policy priorities. India is not some infinite resource island paradise, that has all this geopolitical muscle to expend in every part of the world in order to quell conflicts and wars. We've got our own beep to deal with, right? And therefore, I believe that should the opportunity present itself where India's authority or knowledge or wisdom or influence can make a difference in some aspect of the Israel-Palestine war, I don't think there will be any hesitation in using it.
Yeah, right. I think we'll end it there. Great chat, Shiv. As always, I really loved how you were able to kind of, vividly tell us of how there is no endgame in sight right now. So no one knows really what will happen with the current Israel-Palestine conflict. Israel-Hamas war is concerned. And the largest conflict, I think you've said this once before, and I think I completely agree with you. And this is another example of that. This happens in cycles, and we are seeing yet another cycle. Yeah. And this will, at some point, end, and then maybe, unfortunately, but that's the reality. A few years down the line, there'll be another cycle that happen.
Yeah.
With the situation. Thanks, Shiv, once again. And thanks to our producer, Anna as always. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with your passport.